Once upon a time in the Holy Land, during the era of the rabbinic sages, there was a certain oven. A dispute arose around this oven. Was it, or was it not, ritually pure? The rabbis gathered, encircling it with their arguments like a snake coiled around a sun-warmed stone. All of them agreed it was ritually impure, no good, not kosher. All of them agreed, that is, bar one. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was a conservative who adhered very strictly to the traditional rules. He disputed the validity of midrash, a relatively loose form of interpretation of Jewish law, where old text would be mined for new, creatively tailored meanings. And this Rabbi Eliezer, alone amongst the rabbis, ruled that this oven was A-OK. He gave all the arguments under the sun in favor of his position, but the other rabbis were not swayed. Having failed to convince him through his reasoning, Eliezer switched tactics. He pointed to a carob tree across the field and declared, "If the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, if what I say is true, then that tree will prove it." Right on cue, the tree pulled its roots out of the ground and walked itself 100 cubits across the fields. Some say it was even 400 cubits. Pretty impressive, huh? Now what do you think the other rabbis made of that? They nodded at the walking tree, stroked their beards, turned away from the miraculous sight, looked Rabbi Eliezer in the face, and said, "A tree does not constitute valid legal proof. It has no bearing on the case in question, whether it's walking or doing the jitterbug." So Rabbi Eliezer pointed at a stream and said, "If the law is in accordance with my ruling, then this stream will prove it." And right on cue, the stream started flowing backwards. And so the rabbi said, "Look, I'm sorry, dude, but water is not a valid legal argument, no matter which way it's flowing." Now at this point, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what Rabbi Eliezer thinks he's going to get out of this next one. But whatever the case may be, he tries again and says, "If I'm right, the walls of the study hall will prove it." And right on cue, the walls leaned inward, starting to fall. Now, the text doesn't say where exactly the rabbis were, so obviously if they were in the study hall, then this might not have been Eliezer's brightest idea. But either way, everybody ends up safe because the building didn't fall. And that's because the great Rabbi Yehoshua, or Joshua, turned to the walls and told them off. Basically, he was like, "You're a wall. What the fuck do you know about Jewish law? Have you studied? Have you read the books? If not, then keep your stony nose out of this." And so the walls were stuck kind of between a rock and a hard place. Out of respect for Rabbi Joshua, they stopped falling. But out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer, they didn't straighten back up either. So instead, they just remained leaning there, kind of in limbo, caught between their sense of awe for these two great sages. So at this point, Rabbi Eliezer is just like, "Look, if the halakha, if the right way is in accordance with my opinion, then heaven itself will prove it." And right on cue, the heavens open up and a divine voice, bat kol, a divine voice emerges. And God Almighty, got in on the action, and he straight up said, "Why are you guys arguing with Eliezer? The halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion." So God himself announces that Eliezer is right, and furthermore, that he's always right. So if that doesn't settle it, then what possibly could? And how on earth do you imagine the rabbis responded to that? Well, Rabbi Joshua gets to his feet and says, "It is written, it is not in heaven." Okay, pause for a moment. So when he says it is not in heaven, he's quoting God's words right back to him, right? So specifically, he's quoting from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, which are the core of Jewish law, Jewish ethics, Jewish cosmology, Jewish everything. And he's talking about an episode in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, where God speaks directly to the Jewish people and tells them, "Look, I've made my commandments clear and explicit, all right? So you can't just come back to me afterwards saying, oh, we didn't know. Oh, you told us? What was that?" Okay? I've made it perfectly clear. So the text reads, "For this commandment which I command thee this day, it is not too hard for thee, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that thou shouldest say, Who shall go up for us to heaven, and bring it unto us, and make us to hear it, that we may do it? But the word is very nigh unto thee, in thy mouth and in thy heart, that thou mayest do it." Selah. Basically, God says, I haven't made it impossible, haven't made it inaccessible, so really no excuses. And now, Rabbi Joshua turns these words back against God. And his point is, look, God, if you're saying that you've made it perfectly clear, and so we can't come knocking on your door afterwards complaining we didn't know, then the same goes for you. You can't just come down and tell us what it means or how to do it. You have had your say, and now it's up to us to get on with it, so leave us to it. Ciao, ciao. And that, maybe most miraculously of all, was that. The matter was settled there. The Talmud simply states, since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halakha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. So that particular kind of oven is not kosher. And there we go. Hello, I'm David Leon, and this is Philosophical Storytime. Feel free to look below in the description for the original source in the Talmud and the script of this retelling. So, this story is one of the most famous in the entire Talmud, and it has often been cited through the years by reformers and religious innovators, back from the so-called conservative movement against Orthodox Judaism to liberal voices now in the present day. And it's been used as a way of saying that just because we used to do things in a certain way does not mean that it's right. The book of the law is still open for reinterpretation or even revision, regardless of the original intention of its authors. So even if the ancients, or even if God himself, intended to do things a certain way, if an educated consensus in modern day thinks that we should do things differently, then we can do things differently. And the point of the story is, in essence, that we've grown up as a species. Humanity, we mere and foolish mortals, are the ones in charge now. We can no longer rely on some superior, wiser authority to tell us what to do. If the story of humanity begins in the book of Genesis, with Adam and Eve eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then this story is a sort of climax. We've digested the fruit entirely. And for better or for worse, in practice and on the ground, we are the arbiters of right and wrong. This rebelling against and overcoming of divine authority is a trope which is rife in humanist, free-thinking, or anti-clerical narratives. From Milton's Satan to Shelley's Prometheus, to the plot of basically every single Japanese role-playing game ever, which all wind up one way or another with you getting together with your mates and killing God. And this narrative trope carries at its core an epistemic message, a point about the nature of knowledge and truth. It's about decentering the truth from up there or back then to right here and right now. And it's really refreshing and I think very revealing to see that you don't have to make a break from religious tradition to do that. You don't have to wait for Nietzsche to declare the death of God or Roland Barthes to declare the death of the author. This epistemic move can be made as part of religious tradition itself, and it has been made for thousands of years. And if I might point out one last thing, I would say that the means at arriving at knowledge that the story provides is actually remarkably mature. It's not some fanciful flight of reason or a scientific silver bullet. It's a process, and one which is ongoing, messy, multivocal, and complex. It involves study, reflection, and then coming together and trying to reach consensus. That's what it looks like to try to figure out what the right thing to do is. All right. With all that commentary out of the way, I have to point out that the best part of the story isn't the walking tree or even Rabbi Joshua upbraiding the walls. The best part is actually what happens next. I quote, the Gemara relates, years after, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet, who, by the way, never died, but was carried away by God, and therefore has insider knowledge of the goings-on up in heaven. Rabbi Natan asked Elijah, what did the Holy One, blessed be He, do at that time when Rabbi Joshua issued his declaration? Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be He, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. So, in other words, God Himself takes our side against Himself. He approves of our rebellion against Him. So God is all for the death of God. And just like the master would rejoice at being succeeded and surpassed by the student, God smiles on humanity's coming of age. So that's the story of the Oven of Akhnai. Except it isn't. Because the story doesn't actually end there, and doesn't really begin there either. So if you want to find out how the story continues, its broader context and the reason the authors brought it up in the first place, join us next time on Philosophical Storytime.